Hello everyone, pleasure to be connected. On behalf of the NBSAP Forum, I welcome you all to the fourth webinar session in the Greening Consumption and Production Massive Online Open Course. Today's webinar will focus on greening consumption and production of forest products. I am Hina Ahmed, your course coordinator and co-facilitator. I most warmly welcome you all to the webinar session. This webinar is hosted by Corey Brinkema. Corey serves as the president of the Forest Stewardship Council, US. Corey joined the Forest Stewardship Council in 2007 and serves as chief executive officer of the largest national office of the FSC Global Network. Corey brings 25 years of experience and commitment to sustainable development. Prior to joining FSC, Corey served as executive director of Minnesota-based Green Institute, a regional leader in green building. Corey is a graduate of Dartmouth College and earned his MBA at the University of Michigan. This webinar is also hosted by Brad Kahn. Brad serves as the Communications Director at the Forest Stewardship Council. In this position, Brad manages organizational communications and outreach. Brad helps shape FSC's message and strategies to reach a wide array of audiences. For the past 16 years, Brad has worked in communications, serving nonprofit organizations focused on environmental issues. He has a master's degree from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and a bachelor's in economics from Brown University. Week 4 webinar will discuss greening consumption and production of forest products. The Forest Stewardship Council is a voluntary, market-based approach to protect forests. This webinar will introduce ways that forests are critical to all life on Earth, describe the Forest Stewardship Council and the role it plays, describe what leadership looks like in responsible forest management, and explore market-based initiatives to grow demand for FSC-certified products. This session will offer a look behind the scenes at FSC's strategy to achieve big global changes. Welcome, Corey and Brad, and thanks for accepting this invitation. We are thrilled to have you here today. As usual in our sessions, I would like to remind you of some rules and dynamics in the NBSAP Forum webinar session. Microphones will be muted during the presentation. This reduces interference and facilitates the communication. We will have a 30 to 45 minute presentation followed by a question and answer session. Please send us in advance your questions or raise your hand in the control panel of GoToWebinar. If you want to speak and the connection allows, we will open your microphones during the session. As many of our participants are not English native speakers, me included, I would like to remind our speakers the importance to talk slower. This fosters the comprehension among our practitioners around the world. Now I will transfer the webinar to Brad and Corey. Please enjoy the session. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. This is Corey Brinkema, president of the U.S. Office of the Forest Stewardship Council, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We are very pleased to be presenting to you today, and we will manage this presentation. Brad and I'll take about 15 minutes, turn it over to Brad, and then we'll try to leave a maximum amount of time for questions, answers, and discussion. So again, thank you very much. Brad, next slide. Wonderful. So this is the kind of how we'll proceed through the presentation today. We'll cover the import of forests to global values, global conservation of resources. Cover a little bit about the Forest Stewardship Council and our mission and ambitions. And then Brad will, when I turn it over to Brad, he'll discuss how our standards were developed and what our standards aim to do in the forest specifically, and then discuss some opportunities to shift global consumption, both of consumers and businesses and governments, as well as production. Next slide. So first of all, why do forests matter? So I think many of you are familiar with the many values, ecosystem and social values that forests bring, but just so we have a shared appreciation and understanding, 31% of the terrestrial area of the world is comprised of forests, so it's a very significant amount. Forests provide their soils, protect our fresh water, and the carbon that is stored in forests is a very important component of controlling our climate and can impact the changes in climate as well. So we see this in myriad areas around the world. Also, the import of biodiversity. 80% of the world's terrestrial species call forests their home. And in addition, 1.6 billion of us depend in some way or another on our livelihood, depend on forests. Next slide. So I think it's important to note that even in areas of the world where there are strong regulations around forest management, that poor forestry and poor forest management does exist. This is actually a real picture of a forest in the northwestern portion of the United States, state called Washington, where we see frequently large openings on steep slopes that can contribute significantly to erosion. And in this picture, you see stream zones that feed into larger water bodies that may be home to species like salmon and also impact the ocean waterways where these streams spill out into. So really critical, even in parts of the world where one would think that we have strong regulations protecting against such things. So next slide. So some of the issues that Brad, next slide. Oh, thank you. Okay. So briefly tell you a little bit about the Forest Stewardship Council. So our organization is really born out of events taking place back in 1992. You may recall global governmental leaders held what was called the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, obviously addressing many global concerns related to the environment, but forests were an important component of that conference. And there were attempts to arrive at a consensus decision of what to do with the threats that forests were facing, especially in the tropics. And out of those meetings, which included other non-governmental stakeholders, and side meetings that took place during the conference, those governmental entities really failed to come to that conclusion and a compact to protect forests. So FSC as a non-governmental initiative really grew out of that failure. And those that had attended side meetings and were inspired, I guess, by that failure, whether they be progressive companies, activists on the environmental arena, social activists, indigenous peoples' rights, community rights, labor, etc., came together and explored what, through non-governmental means, non-regulatory means, forest stakeholders could do to exact that change that they wanted to see. So the FSC was really born out of that. In 1994, we held our first, what we call General Assembly of those stakeholders, and formed FSC as an official organization, and created the first set of standards, consensus-based standards as to what would constitute a responsibly managed forest. And then FSC was really set up to be a market mechanism to reward good forest management. So set high standards, try to create some value in the marketplace for a label. You'll see our tree and check mark down there in the lower left-hand corner, using that label in the marketplace to reward those good practices by those forest managers. Next slide. So these are some of the stakeholders that came together, some right from the beginning, and others have joined along the way here. We're 22 years, actually 23 years old now. Organizations like the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace, Nature Conservancy, which are global organizations. In the US, we have national organizations like the Natural Resources Defense Council and the National Wildlife Federation, who are also deeply involved in FSC, and you know, they sit at the same table with companies like Kimberly-Clark, the makers of Kleenex and Cottonelle, or HP, or International Paper, one of the largest paper companies in the world, and smaller companies like the Collins companies, who have been, I think, would argue that they've been managing their forests well for many, many years. But these folks have come together and together agreed on a set of what we call principles and criteria that define our standards, and have negotiated essentially what is a definition of responsible forest management. Next slide. So a little bit about our reach around the world. Again, we're about 23 years old. We have close to 200 million hectares now certified around the world to our standards. I think while FSC, certainly a major impetus for forming FSC was to tackle deforest and degradation in the tropics, we also knew we had a lot of work to do in the temperate and boreal forests of the world, and perhaps, as one might expect, the adoption of FSC standards in our early days increased at a very high rate in those countries where the gap between our standards and what perhaps the regulatory environment in those countries calls for, where that gap is small, the adoption was high. And also places where we have consumers that might be perhaps more likely to pay a little bit more, for example, or simply look out for products with that are produced by more responsible manufacturers. Of course, FSC has very big ambitions in the tropics, in places where those gaps between conventional forestry and forest management and our standards is higher. But what we've done is we've essentially, to date, have created an important market mechanism in many of those more developed countries, countries where there's also a lot of importation of those tropical products, and with that foundation now are seeing in the last especially 5 years here or so some significant activity in places like Brazil and Chile, in the Congo basin of Africa, and countries like Cameroon and the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Southeast Asia, particularly in Malaysia, and now Indonesia, and also in China, especially when it comes to production. We have our largest chain of custody certificate holder base now in that country, and then of course, from a forest management standpoint, Russia is now our second largest country in terms of forest management certification. So definitely on a significant growth trajectory, and at this point largely based on market demand in countries like the US and Canada and Western Europe and Japan, Australia. But we have very exciting market research now that is telling us that places like China and Brazil and many other countries, their consumer base is very ripe for what we believe FSC can deliver to consumers in those countries. So very excited about the market potential for FSC there. Next slide. So just a little bit before I turn it over to Brad, how does FSC work? I think I mentioned a couple times here what we call our forest management standards based on a global set of principles and criteria. Brad will share with you a little bit about those standards. But we've created those standards in concert with global forest stakeholders, environmental activists, social interests, indigenous peoples groups, companies that work in the forest, companies that produce forest products have all come together and created a consensus-based standard. We have a modest amount of adaptation that is permitted at the local level to ensure that local, national level concerns can be addressed. And then through what we call third-party auditing, through the accreditation of third-party certifying bodies, the standard is audited so that companies who choose voluntarily to participate in the FSC system can claim that they are managing their forest responsibly. So we start off, the kind of foundation of FSC is the forest management certification. And then in order to credibly continue that FSC claim through to the eventual user of a forest product that comes from an FSC forest, we've created what we call a chain of custody system, which is also based on certification. And you know, the best way of thinking about it is it's really an inventory control system. So the companies along the way, from a raw primary sawmill to a factory, potentially a secondary processor, you know, all the way to, for example, let's say a tissue product in a grocery retailer. We, through certification of those entities along the supply chain, those companies have proven to their auditors that they are capable of differentiating and distinguishing the FSC product within their production, within their supply chain, segregating it from non-certified products and being able to credibly make that FSC claim to the next downstream entity within that supply chain. So that's what chain of custody certification is all about. So that when you let's say you're a consumer in that grocery store, you've purchased that FSC certified tissue product, you can be assured that through purchase of that product that you have committed to, you're holding a product that is directly contributing to good forest management, to responsible forest management. Great, next slide. I think I did turn it over to you, Brad, here.
Yep. Great, thank you all. Thanks, Corey. My name is Brad Kahn. I'm the Communications Director for the Forest Stewardship Council in the US, and I'm going to talk through the second half of our presentation here. What makes FSC the gold standard or the leadership standard for responsible forest management? So in terms of governance, FSC is a member-led democracy. We have members in 3 chambers: economic, social, and environmental. So all the businesses are in the economic chamber. Social chamber tends to be indigenous associations, labor unions, community development organizations, groups like Oxfam that kind of cut across different sectors or categories. And then the environmental chamber tends to be either global, national, or local environmental organizations. We further divide our chambers into global north and global south to ensure equal power balance between the northern and southern hemispheres. And in order for a policy decision to be made at our General Assembly, we need majority support from all three chambers. And this, while it's fairly technical in how it's implemented, it's actually the critical foundation upon which our credibility rests, because we really do give voice to a broad swath of stakeholders from around the world. And these stakeholders come together to define what does responsible forest management really mean. So sometimes we like to talk about other aspects of our forest management standard: water, biodiversity, use of chemicals, and I'll say some things about those. But this governance model, when it was implemented, was very innovative, especially at a global scale and for an NGO. And today is being mirrored in many other organizations. And for FSC, it's really key to our credibility and our integrity. FSC prohibits deforestation. We have something called a policy for association. So we actually extend this prohibition beyond just the lands that are certified. But if we can show that a company is, say, managing one area of forest responsibly under FSC standards, but in another place is converting forest from, say, natural forest into a plantation, maybe for palm oil or for pulp, or perhaps converting a natural forest into, say, real estate development, as we have in places in the United States around urban areas, then that company will lose certification throughout its ownership. And we're really trying to say that FSC stands against deforestation, and this should really be the starting point for any definition of responsible management. And so this can be tricky to implement. Companies can be big and have diverse ownerships, but we really try to stand firm in our prohibition of deforestation, or forest conversion, as it is called in the industry. FSC protects rare old growth and other forests of high conservation values. So we look at the forest types across a landscape, and we really try to make sure that an FSC certified forest is placed within the context of what makes it special across this landscape, and how do we protect those values that this forest is providing. And so in many parts of the world, primary forest or old growth forest, as we call it in the United States, is very rare. And so this is an example of the kind of forest that FSC would require a landowner to identify and protect. There may also be certain forest types that are very rare. Maybe it's species composition or something else about the forest that is special, and FSC is going to require landowners to identify and protect those values. FSC protects wildlife. So around the world, there's different regulations in place. In the United States, we have the Endangered Species Act, but there's also other regulations and laws in place. Really everywhere in the world, FSC is going to go beyond what's required by law to protect wildlife that is at risk of becoming extinct. And so that doesn't just mean that it's formally listed under some law to require protection. It actually looks at where the species populations are healthy or where they're in decline. And if the species populations are in decline, then FSC is going to take a precautionary approach and say, we need to make sure that these species do not go extinct, or even in the regional area do not get extirpated from that region. So we're really going to take a precautionary approach to wildlife and require that landowners leave habitat sufficient so that that wildlife population can continue to not just exist, but thrive. FSC restricts hazardous pesticides. Many people are not aware that forestry, like agriculture, can be very chemically intensive. When you're managing, in some cases, millions of hectares, you don't have a lot of time to walk on the ground and hand apply chemicals. So it's also very common that these chemicals are sprayed from either helicopters or airplanes. FSC is going to tightly restrict this activity. It doesn't mean that you can't use chemicals in the FSC system. There are some cases where when you cut some trees down, the first thing to grow up is going to be, say, a broadleaf tree that is an invasive species, and you don't really want it in your forest. And so that's where, say, the use of chemicals might be applied to restrict those trees so that maybe the coniferous species can have time to grow up. That would be one example. There are other reasons to use it, perhaps because you have an infestation by a certain kind of beetle that would be harming the forest. There are lots of reasons to use chemicals, but generally speaking, there's a list of highly hazardous chemicals that the World Health Organization and the Pesticide Action Network maintain. FSC is going to draw from those resources, and if they're on the highly hazardous list, then landowners are going to be restricted in their use of those chemicals, not just in the chemical itself, but also in the application. So FSC is going to tend to push people towards the narrowest spectrum, so that the most focused use of chemical as well as the most focused application. And this is very different than how it's done in sort of business as usual practices, where the application of hazardous chemicals from the air is very common. FSC protects water resources. So somewhere between 2/3 and 70% of the world's fresh water begins in forests. It obviously depends where in the world you are, but as a general number, it's about there at that level. And so when we think about forests, and one of the primary ecosystem services or benefits of nature that they provide, forests provide our drinking water, and really there's very little on earth that's more precious to humanity than clean drinking water, as I'm sure many of you understand. And so FSC is going to look at waterways, small streams, in some cases even ephemeral streams that may be dry during the hot dry season and then become running again in the wetter seasons. Even these ephemeral streams are going to become protected under the FSC system, because during that heavy, in our part of the world, spring runoff, but whenever the rains come, those small streams then connect into larger networks and can carry soil and sediment and other products downstream, which can hurt wildlife, but can also affect drinking water quality. So FSC is really going to again apply the precautionary approach to make sure that landowners are leaving buffers and other vegetation along stream courses to protect that water quality, and also to protect the water temperature in places where the wildlife need cool, clear water. So that's a little bit about what FSC does. Now, how are we trying to change the marketplace? So how are we trying to shift consumption and production? And what we're looking at here is a Kimberly-Clark line of hand towels. So we are in what we'd call in the United States a not-for-profit organization, globally an NGO, non-governmental organization. We have approximately 200 people working around the world. We're operating in with staff of one form or another in about 90 countries. So if you do the math, you can see that we're stretched pretty thin. In some countries there's one person who's a point of contact. Corey mentioned the U.S. has the largest national office. I believe we're at about 6 people right now trying to cover the entire United States. So we look for leverage opportunities. So while FSC is a big global brand in some respects, we're also a scrappy NGO in many other respects, and we have to look for the ways we can create change. So we primarily operate in two different strategies: business to business and business to consumer. B2B, or business to business, is where we have historically emphasized our actions and our strategies, working on purchasing and procurement policies. So getting organizations, whether they are governments or businesses, to develop procurement policies or purchasing policies around use of forest products. And in many cases, to try to have those organizations say in those policies that we prefer FSC certified products, we will use them whenever available, and even perhaps set goals around that to say we will, by 2020, half of our forest products use will be FSC. By 2025, it'll be 3/4. Those are just examples, but setting goals based on real purchasing decisions that are being made is a way to shift consumption at the business level. And every business, whether it's large or small, is using forest products virtually every day. Everyone uses paper. Many businesses have packaging, or everyone has a bathroom in their office that uses toilet tissue and hand towels and things like that. So when you start to look at it, as well as in construction materials, business has a real lever there, as does government, and the same approaches have been applied at the business and the government levels. Green standards, these are just a few. LEED and BREEAM are perhaps two very well known. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has some guidelines that they give to all the government purchasers, and FSC is part of those guidelines for solid wood. So we look for points where we can have influence, and then these coalitions of businesses like the Sustainability Consortium or the Consumer Goods Forum, Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. These are organizations that organize global businesses under one umbrella and try to shape their purchasing and their policies around a whole range of topics tied into sustainability. But when it comes to forest products, FSC tries to influence their decision making to encourage use of FSC certified products. More recently, we've begun going direct to consumers, and this is obviously a critically important because consumers ultimately drive the vast majority of economic activity on the planet, and consumer decisions can directly influence business or government decisions. But of course, going direct to consumers is much harder because there's so many of them, and we don't have a massive advertising budget. So we work with NGOs. One example was the National Wildlife Foundation in the United States has a garden furniture guide that they have about 2 million members, and they talk to their members about selecting garden furniture that is FSC certified. A group like the World Wildlife Fund has millions of members globally, and they talk to their members about FSC more generally. We're also working with the World Wildlife Fund's Global Forest and Trade Network, which is a collection of the world's largest users of forest products. Everyone from Procter & Gamble and Kimberly-Clark, International Paper. A lot of the companies that we work with are part of GFTN, as it's known, and we are actually working with these companies to build the FSC brand. They all use FSC in their marketing and in their on-product labeling, and so they have been increasingly talking to consumers about FSC and why they value it, why it matters, which raises the FSC brand. And then our goal is actually to use FSC as a differentiator and a way to drive purchases in the consumer environment. And so increasingly we're working directly with companies who want to talk to consumers about FSC in direct corporate marketing initiatives. Many of them, just recently, Kimberly-Clark for their Scott tissues and their Cottonelle products have begun putting prominent labeling on the FSC about FSC and also the World Wildlife Fund's Panda on their products, and trying to go directly to their consumers to talk about why responsible forest management is important and what it means to their company, and how consumers can make a difference. FSC launched a digital resource guide, which basically provides companies with the assets, with the tools they need to talk to their customers about FSC and about responsible management of the world's forests. So this is just a subset, a short list of some of the companies that have policies in place that say we will use as much FSC-certified materials or products as possible in our operations and in our production. And so you can see there's these are skewed towards American companies, but there are some strong global brands here. IKEA, Unilever, Tetra Pak, Lego Group have all really differentiated themselves in their sectors with strong policies that say, in case of, say, IKEA, 100% of their use of forest products by, I believe, 2020 will be FSC, which is a huge commitment and a huge leadership position for a company that I've heard people say represents about 1% of the trade in forest products globally is to feed IKEA demand. So, that is a huge number, and for them to commit to 100% FSC was really stepping out there, and they're actually well on that path. And it's hard to say if they'll succeed, but they're certainly moving in that direction, and it look like they'll have good success. Engaging consumers. This is just very quickly a little bit about our strategy. So FSC is a global network. You've seen a lot of the organizations that are involved in one way or another. And because branding these days, or consumer engagement, is moving from just one company sort of repeating a message to consumers over and over through television advertising or print advertising. These days with social media, people hear about, get information in so many different ways and in so many different channels that no one organization can be in every place, and you can't control it in the way that maybe you could 10 or 20 years ago. So FSC's strategy is to turn our network into a strength and work with our partners to share messages about FSC and why it's important. And so this is just an example of the kinds of stakeholders that we engage with, and then ideally encourage these organizations to share messages about FSC so that consumers are hearing about FSC from a lot of different places. We recently launched an anthem video out of concern for bandwidth and frankly the time for this presentation. We're not going to show it here, but it's at onesimpleaction.fsc.org, and it's really meant to be a consumer-facing video, just about a little more than a minute and a half in length, designed to tell the story of what FSC is and why it matters to a consumer who may not have thought about it before. And I would say that our video is really designed to create an emotional connection. FSC, historically as a B2B brand, we didn't really focus a lot of energy on emotional storytelling. It was really much more of a logical case to, say, businesses or governments about why any of this matters. But when it comes to consumers, you really have to have an emotional connection for people to care, because there's so much to care about in the world these days. There's so many challenges and opportunities for people to think about that you have to break through. And so this anthem video is the first step in our effort to really make an emotional connection with consumers. And so I encourage you all to take a look at it. And then, working with our NGO allies and partners to share a message. We have a concept called social applause. So when a company does something good, these types of organizations, all of whom are members of FSC, can help amplify that that accomplishment, mostly through social media, but also through their own websites, newsletters, other vehicles. And just as an example of some of the companies that have made big FSC commitments in public, I mentioned IKEA. Patagonia recently introduced the world's first FSC-certified wetsuit. So rubber, of course, is a forest product, and neoprene is typically what wetsuits are made of, but neoprene is actually a toxic material that produces dioxin in the middle part of its life cycle. And so Patagonia transitioned its wetsuits to natural rubber, a product called Ulex, which is made from FSC-certified rubber plantations. And they rolled this out with a huge marketing campaign to their mailing list, which is a few million people, really talking about why forests are important, what FSC does. They had videos, they had social media. It was a really big splash for a sort of, call it a medium-sized company, but really set the bar high in terms of an innovative product, but also really creative storytelling. I won't go through the rest of these, but maybe in question and answer, if anyone wants to know more about any of these companies, I'm happy to say more about it. And I think with that, we'll just say thank you and turn it to any Q&A or questions and answers that folks might have. And just thanks to the organizers for giving us this opportunity to present a little bit about FSC.
Many thanks, Brad and Corey, for sharing your valuable time with our participants. This was an extremely interesting presentation and most helpful for our course participants to begin week 4 of the course. Now, I would like to invite our attendees to share their questions, doubts, and comments in the question box, or press the Raise Your Hand tab to participate in the question and answer session. Please use the control panel of the GoToWebinar platform. We can open your microphone or read your question depending on your preference. Although I strongly encourage you to ask questions, it is a rare privilege to have Corey and Brad with us today. Please don't hesitate. We can all learn from each other. Asking questions to initiate discussions is one step towards it. Many thanks again, Corey and Brad, for your time. I'll open the mic now for hands raised. Okay. I'll read a question first. This is by Trevor Shaw from Canada. Do you have a gauge estimation of how much of the total forest production in Canada is FSC certified or not certified? Do you have stats globally? Thank you.
You want to take that, Corey?
Oh, sure. Yeah, actually, I will, while we're doing the other questions, get the exact figures for you of the penetration of FSC certification. I can actually, in a moment here, bring up a map that shows the FSC certified land base versus the existing crown lands that are available for production, and I'll get that figure. So I don't have it right off the top of my head, but can get that very quickly for you. And yeah, I mean, we've estimated that I think it's roughly 13% globally of forests that are available for active management, meaning some level of production, some level of forest products coming off of those lands. Roughly 13% of that is currently FSC certified. Obviously, there are many forests around the world that either community owned and protected, or in the context of some national settings where there are protections, like in the United States, we have national parks and do in many other countries. That 13% isn't out of that of that total is just the production lands. We do believe that actually, though, in terms of global production, FSC is even higher than that, and that is because of the level of penetration that we have in many of the more developed countries that I mentioned, the US, especially Western Europe, where our highest penetration rates are. In some cases, FSC is 30 to, I think now we're at 35% of the trade in forest products in countries like the Netherlands. In Germany, it's a little bit lower than that, but still a very high number. So even in countries, for example, like our own here in the United States, where our penetration in the forest products marketplace is probably around 5%. We have, I think, some higher ambitions and some, I guess, optimism that that potential is there to be a bigger force for change, and especially if we have success in activating and educating the consumer around what we do.
Oh, thank you for the insight. The next hand raised is by Elnaz Kivani. I apologize if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. I'm going to unmute you now, Elnaz. I hope you can ask your question. Elnaz, can you hear me?
Yes.
Please go ahead and ask your question. Elnaz, please go ahead. I think we cannot hear Elnaz. The next hand raised is by Lisa Hawks. Lisa, I'm going to unmute you now. Please ask your question.
Hello. My question is about biomass and your views on it. So I believe that companies will increasingly start looking for biomass to replace fossil fuel as they seek to reduce their carbon footprint. My question for you is, what roles should we be expecting forests to play? Can they support this additional demand, and what are the key factors that should be considered, particularly with biomass?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great and very timely question. We are indeed, as FSC, as an organization, as a group of forest stakeholders, are very much grappling with the interest and growth in the biomass energy industry. So the predominant drivers at this point in time largely are European Union electricity producers who are seeking to substitute biomass for some of their coal inputs in coal-fired electricity power plants. So much of that biomass is actually expected to come from the U.S. Southeast, a bit from Canada. The Baltics are expected to participate as well. But yeah, the lion's share of that biomass is expected to come from the U.S. Southeast. And FSC is, I can tell you, is almost always a neutral to the final use of a particular forest product, meaning that our focus is primarily on what is happening on the ground in the forest. If that forest is being managed well, is being managed according to our standards, we believe that the consumers of whatever that final product is should have the confidence that that material is coming from a responsible source. Now, that being said, we recognize that there are concerns. There are very real concerns around some intended uses of forest products. So, for example, with biomass, we recognize that there's quite a bit of scientific data out there that the immediate burning of biomass and the release of that carbon into the atmosphere does not necessarily result in a carbon neutral product, meaning we see some in industry that would claim that it is entirely carbon neutral product because you're for every biomass pellet that you consume and fire in a electricity generation station, the carbon is absorbed by new trees that grow in its place. And the challenge that we recognize is that is really an issue of timing. Yes, maybe over a 50-year period, we might be looking at carbon neutrality, but in fact, that biomass is burned immediately, that carbon is emitted, and then it may take decades for that carbon to be absorbed by a regenerating forest. So when we're talking about issues of as great as climate change, that that may be too late to achieve that carbon neutrality. So these are the kinds of things we're grappling with. We're also deeply concerned about the growth of that industry, especially if it comes from non-FSC certified forests. What could be happening to the biodiversity and other environmental and social values where, for example, those biomass pellets might come from. So it's I can't say that we have all the answers right now. Certainly, we are very much working with those entities that are seeking to manage the forest resources responsibly. So to date, that is largely the power producers from the Netherlands who have created the most stringent standards around this. But yes, it is a vexing issue and one that many of our members, especially environmental members, are actively campaigning against that co-firing and the potential negative consequences coming from that.
Can I just add one other aspect of this, which is currently FSC does not make any carbon claims tied to our forest management certification. There's a lot of energy to try to figure out if we're going to have an auditor going out into the field assessing a forest across a variety of different criteria. Could that auditor also do something around verifying a carbon claim in that forest, looking at additional carbon being stored because of the FSC standards above and beyond what would otherwise be allowed under the law, and come out of that audit with a verified carbon claim? That has not been implemented in our system yet, although there are people researching how that might work. And so when we think about biomass, so much of it hinges on carbon and whether the forest is storing more carbon, or whether the short-term emissions, the challenges they cause outweigh the longer-term sequestration in the forest. And so understanding how FSC relates to carbon would be a key part of that as far as how our organization might take a position on biomass. And so that's another piece of the work that is yet to be done.
Thank you, Brad and Corey. The next hand raised is by Yo Osei Obusu. Apologies again. I'm going to unmute you now, Yo. Please go ahead and ask your question. Yo, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation. I want to find out the extent to which their activities have had impact, particularly in Ghana. To what extent, in West Africa, to what extent has the FSC impacted on forest conservation in West Africa? That's the simple question.
Corey, do you want me to take that, or do you want to take it?
Sure. I can maybe start off. And again, another great question, and an area that FSC is paying particular attention to is the quantifying both quantifying and qualifying the impacts on the ground in the forest, in forest communities that FSC certification promises to provide. So that's something that we're spending quite a bit of time reaching out to institutions, researchers, and others who are willing to work with us to spend the time to analyze those impacts. And I can tell you that to date there have been a number of third parties. For example, and I'm really probably talking more about Central Africa specifically, but WWF has done research into the impact, for example, of FSC certification on primates in working forests. So there's a fair amount of research there. Quite positive results in terms of the protections afforded to primates, both in and around those working forests. There are also some studies that I'm aware of regarding the protection of the rights for indigenous peoples in places like Cameroon, pygmy and pygmy-related communities that have been positively impacted by FSC-certified forest concessionaires. But yeah, we actually have on our, I mean, maybe Brad, we can call it up, but certainly if you're able to get onto the FSC International website, which you can directly link to ic.fsc.org, and there's a whole section of the FSC International's website devoted to third-party research on the impacts of FSC. I'm not directly familiar with studies specifically in West Africa, but they might be there perhaps. And certainly, again, in the very, very near future here, we expect to be able to provide more comprehensive research of the impacts of FSC around the globe.
Yeah, I've put up the map of FSC around the world again, so folks can see it. I have to admit my West African geography isn't perfect, but I believe there's a small amount of FSC certified forest in Ghana. I'm seeing it as the country with the light green showing. You can see that in a lot of the activity that we have in Africa is actually right now sort of centered on the Congo Basin, where there's obviously some real forest conservation opportunities, working with local communities and governments and NGOs and businesses to try to protect the values of those forests and help the people who rely on those forests while a lot of industry moves in to try to manage those forests and make sure that management happens responsibly and not either in a destructive way or in the worst case, illegally. So FSC has been a tool that organizations have been using in the Congo Basin to try to address some of the governance challenges and try to help some of the local communities and indigenous peoples in those regions.
Brad, can you transfer the screen to me briefly so I can just share the slide on Canadian.
I don't know if I have that ability. I think I might have stopped sharing now. Can any of the organizers do it?
Yeah, just please hold on.
Wonderful. Yes, I think so. Can everyone see that?
Yes, we can.
Great, wonderful. So yeah, there was a question regarding the level of certification in Canada. So I don't actually have the specific percentage of production forests in Canada, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's roughly about 15 to 20%. But here's a map of it. lands depicted here in red are the FSC forests. There are also lands with kind of hash marks that are certified under some other standard. There are standards that have been developed by the conventional forest products industry, and they also have wide penetration in Canada. But here you'll see FSC largely concentrated in the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, and to some extent in Alberta, and a little bit in British Columbia and the Maritimes. Yeah, the pulp and paper industry certainly is the largest driver for FSC certification in Canada. And there's some very, very challenging issues that FSC is tackling right now that we believe if consensus solutions can be found. For example, one of the main ones we're dealing with is free, prior, and informed consent of Native peoples. In the case of Canada, what are called First Nations peoples. If we can figure out what are the proper and fair requirements placed on land managers for seeking that consent from First Nations that have claims on those lands. If we can also manage the issue that has been vexing governments in Canada for decades, but around protection of what we call high conservation values, and particularly iconic species like the caribou. If we can arrive at consensus agreements on those issues in particular, we certainly believe there's a real opportunity for FSC to expand, especially in Canada. So we're looking forward to that. Again, very, very challenging issues, ones that we're tackling right now, but we're optimistic for the future, especially in Canada. So thank you. Maybe, I guess you can hold on to this slide if you want, or have Brad take over here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brad and Corey. Should I move to the next question?
Sure.
Sure. Why don't we see what the next question is before we determine whether it makes sense to switch screens?
Okay, great. The next question is by Y Park. Do you think that the FSC certification is only applicable to big corporates? The small and medium-sized companies might not be able to fulfill the FSC criteria due to lack of modality. How does FSC address this matter to encourage more corporates to follow FSC standards?
You want to take that, Brad?
Sure. So I would say that early adoption, and I'm really talking about the first 10 to 15 years, especially in the developed countries where FSC grew fastest initially, there were larger industrial players who got in the system, and they bring a lot more of the forest land with them when they do, as well as the companies that are manufacturing and selling FSC certified products. But as an organization, it is really one of our top priorities in our strategic plan to grow the number of smallholders who are accessing our system. And we've had significant success already engaging small landowners or community forest managers or local organizations, local communities. There's lots of different models for local management of local forests, whether it's a family forest owner in the US Southeast or more of a community forest model, maybe in the Amazon. There are lots of different models for how local people manage small tracts of forest. And for FSC, that is incredibly important for us to be able to work for those various models. And so we have a smallholder certification program. There's various tools involved, and actually some research that shows that smallholders in the Amazon are actually achieving a premium for FSC certification, which of course goes a long way in justifying the additional work. In some places, it's not about a premium. So for example, in the US Southeast, which is a globally significant region from the perspective of both forest products marketplace, but also in terms of biodiversity. It really is, in many respects, the wood basket of the world, and the ownership pattern in that region is mostly small family-owned woodlands or small family-owned forests, anywhere from maybe 50 to 500 hectares, somewhere in that scale would be common. And so we have to be able to work on that scale in order for us to work for those family and small forest owners. And so we have a group certification program that allows landowners to share costs across a landscape, and so that lowers the barriers. We also have been working with consulting foresters or foresters who might serve a variety of different landowners. Sometimes these smallholders, if they're provided with technical support, maybe the barriers are less about money and more about technical expertise, help writing a management plan, for example. There have been companies have been investing in those kinds of technical supports. But it's fair to say we have more work to do on that front, and especially in the tropical regions, we want to make sure we are a system that works for smallholders. So it really is a priority going forward, and we have a lot more work to do on that front. But we've seen quite a bit of success already, I would say, and there's a fair bit of research showing that smallholders who do access our system have access to markets and may achieve a premium, which both of which can be helpful for them to justify the additional time and energy they have to put into earning FSC certification. Corey, did you want to say something? I heard you clear your throat there, but I wasn't sure if that was.
Sorry about that. No, I was actually going to say I could probably take one if there's time to take one more question. I'm going to need to drop off just a little bit early here, but Brad will continue to answer questions.
Happy to take one more or two more or however many more questions folks have, if anyone's still on the line.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was on mute. I was reading the question.
That's okay.
The next question is by Monica Moldovan. Could you please elaborate a bit more on whether FSC still certifies the logging of primary forests, and why is this considered sustainable, since these 100 years old forest ecosystems will lose their valuable ecosystem services once they become fragmented? Would you like me to repeat?
You want me to take that? No, I got it. Corey, you want that, or you want me to?
Sure. I mean, Brad, maybe you can elaborate. I do need to get going pretty quickly. So, yeah. This is also a very important question, and I will say that FSC does not prohibit the certification and/or active management of forests containing what we would consider primary forest qualities. We have some of those even in the United States, what we typically call old growth. What I can tell you is that while FSC won't absolutely prevent, let's say, for example, a harvest in a primary forest or the removal of a single tree, FSC standards absolutely require the maintenance of those ecosystem and other potentially even social community values associated with that primary forest. So if the land manager can prove that they can maintain and/or enhance those qualities that primary forest, wherever it might be in the world, delivers, then and they can prove that even with some generally very, very minor active management in those lands, that they can maintain those values, then that is possible. But the vast majority of lands that one could call primary forest within the FSC system are generally either set aside as what we call a representative sample area. They are designated what are called high conservation value forests. We have various characterizations of those high conservation values, so they have to be designated, and the values under those have to be, as I said, protected. So, but a more recent enhancement specifically to this designation that FSC continues to work through are what we call intact forest landscapes, or the acronym IFL. And these are large, again, what would be called primary forests, unentered tracts of land, typically over 10,000 hectares, that we recognize globally that have significance because of their large scale. And how does FSC specifically protect those intact forest landscapes? So we're dealing with this in a significant way in places like the Congo Basin, in Southeast Asia, and in the Boreal, especially in Russia and in Canada. So exactly, what those protections are, how does FSC manage potentially some of the conflicting cultural interests in those areas, especially from indigenous peoples. Those are issues that we are grappling with right now. So Brad, I'll turn it to you, and then I need to go. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Corey.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So your question started with why, or included why, and this is a challenging issue because if you remember back to the slide where we said 1.6 billion people on the planet depend on forests in one way or another for their livelihoods, and not just livelihoods, but also for cultural or religious purposes or traditional uses, perhaps around medicine gathering or non-timber forest products collection. There's lots of reasons people depend on forests. And there's a social equity issue here where, say in the United States, we cut our forests down 200 years ago. That doesn't make it more or less right. We converted our forests into economic development, and we did it a while ago, and now we have primarily second growth. We still have some old growth, and FSC will require protections for it, but we got out of the gate faster than in other places. But in those other places, especially in communities where maybe indigenous people have been managing forests responsibly for thousands of years, you would look at it and say it's a primary forest because they've been doing very careful selection of very small numbers of trees. To say that they can no longer manage their forests because they've done a good job, or perhaps in a place where they're lesser developed in terms of community development or even national development, and to say, well, we're just going to say you can't manage those forests because they're primary, that's putting those people and those nations at a disadvantage, and there is an equity issue there, especially since a lot of those forests tend to be in the southern hemisphere. Of course, they're critical from a carbon or an ecological perspective, but we also need to weigh the social values at play. And so FSC, we represent a compromise between economic, social, and environmental stakeholders. And we've heard loud and clear from indigenous associations and indigenous groups, from local communities, that to say no to all primary forests is to tell us we're not afforded the same rights as Europe or North America were afforded 100 or 200 years ago, sometimes by taking lands from indigenous people. So, we hear those arguments loud and clear. And so we were debating how to define responsible in a way that balances those social, economic, and environmental values. And it's challenging. Our General Assembly is coming up in Vancouver, British Columbia in October of this year. And these are exactly the kinds of issues that our members will be coming together to debate, and in some cases to debate very vigorously. It's a polite conversation, but it's full of passion. as people try to decide what does responsible really mean and how does FSC then represent that. So it's on the surface, it's an issue that can look pretty simple, but when you're dealing with people whose lives depend on how those forests are managed, it can get pretty hotly debated. And so we're the platform for that debate to happen.
Thank you, Brad. I'm afraid we have ran out of time. We have 4 minutes for the last question. The next hand raised is by Tueta Skorin. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. Tueta, I'm going to unmute you. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I can, thank you.
Thank you for this lecture. It was really interesting to see. I'm from Croatia and I'm working in environmental education, but I'm also a stakeholder in the IPBS arena. And it's nice to see this kind of organization. And actually I have 2 questions, I'll be quick. So the first one is connected to, it's nice to see that you have social, economic and environmental chamber or members. How did you manage to achieve that? It seems to me that it's really, in NGO sense, it's really progressive, and to combine those 3 and connected to that, how did you manage to attract businesses to support you without maybe seeing some incentives? Because I think it takes time for businesses to see that someone will buy their products if they have this kind of certificate. And my second question is about you rely on for the education of the people, you rely on the other organizations, but also you do it yourself to help you persuade people to see why this kind of certificate is important, why should they buy products that are sustainable, etc. Have you ever considered or how to do how to get it on the next level? That because this takes a lot of effort for different organizations to try to persuade people about these certificates. Have you considered how to do it like in mainstream education to know about the ecosystem services that, for instance, Forest does for people, and that people kind of, they grow up with, so the people in general everywhere grow up with this notion of the importance of forest and sustainable management of forests. I don't know if you understand the second question.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, thank
you.
Before you begin,
thank you.
I apologize, but we are left with 3 to 4 minutes. I apologize. I hope you're able to answer.
No, that's fine. Okay. I'll keep it short. So the 3-chamber system really grew out of our founding. FSC was not the first to come up with the idea of balancing economic, social, and environmental values or interests, but we were led by some initial people who came out of sustainable development. We're familiar with the UN processes around Rio or Summit and others, and just understood that first and foremost you have to balance around the 3 legs of the sustainability: economic, social, and environmental, and then also looking at global north and global south. I mean, that is perhaps less a part of our story, but equally important and a critical part of our system, because the development issues in the north are very different than the development issues in the south, just generally speaking. So that was really part of our founding values, and the idea of giving sort of equal authority and equal voice to a range of different issues and stakeholders. We felt that was critical, because if people didn't feel like they had a meaningful way to engage and to make a difference, then why would they come to the table? So we wanted, because we realized this issue of deforestation and forest degradation required a lot of people around the table, we created a system that showed we valued different voices, and that different stakeholders would have a chance to make a difference, and it was worth their time and energy to get involved. Business, we were lucky that, you can't really speak about business generically. There are some businesses that are not going to do anything more than whatever the law requires or whatever they can get away with, frankly, in some places. Those are not primarily the businesses that we're working with. There are a lot of businesses that want to do the right thing. They have values baked into their strategies and frankly their DNA. Who they are is about trying to be good corporate citizens of the world and try to maintain their social license to operate. And those are the kinds of organizations that are drawn to FSC. And frankly, in the world today with social media and a growing level of awareness around social and environmental issues, those are the businesses that tend to be doing well. And so initially we had a smaller number of businesses that saw the value. They were in the forest product sector, and they realized that if we can't figure out sustainability in the forest product sector, we don't have a lot of future as a company because we depend on forests. And if we cut them all down today, what are we going to do tomorrow? So, they got it. And then over time, as we built momentum, more businesses came into our system. We have done a fair bit of outreach, and usually it's at the national level offices to the educational system. It's critically important, and there's a lot more we could do there. It's also, there's a lot of people and organizations competing to be in that space. A lot of people understand that, if you want to be, relevant in the future, you need to start reaching people, when they're in school, and whether that's, early education or secondary or post-secondary. It's a very, very hotly contested space in some ways because everyone is trying to get their information out through those vehicles. And it has not been a huge emphasis of FSC. We've been frankly just trying to get our system up and running and hitting a critical mass. If you look over the arc of the 23 years that we've been operating, but there's a lot of opportunity to do more. And we actually have something called FSC Friday, which is a global event focused on raising awareness about FSC. And in that setting, we do a lot of classroom activities and have resources for schools to teach kids about FSC on that day, recognizing that it gives us probably our best chance to try to break through into the educational setting. And there's a lot more that happens on FSC Friday, but that would be the one day that I think we really try to get resources out to educators to share the stories. So I put my email address as well as Corey's up on the screen. So if anyone has follow-up questions or wants more information, please don't be shy about emailing us, and we'd be happy to provide additional information and share what we can with you. So I'll just say thank you to everyone for setting this up. We really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you to all of you for the 63 of you who are still on the line. We appreciate you sticking until the bitter end.
Many thanks, Brad, for your time, and thank you all for your participation in week 4 webinar of the MOOC series. We are really grateful, Brad, and we are very grateful to Corey as well that you were able to join us.
Well, thank you for the
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And for our participants, we will post the webinar recording on our NBSAP Forum YouTube channel. The webinar recording link, along with a copy of the presentation, will also be posted on the Conservation Training course room notice board, sent via email to all MOOC registrants, and posted on the NBSAP Forum homepage. Please don't forget to visit the NBSAP Forum homepage for weekly course summaries posted by the course facilitators in each language. Please don't hesitate to contact me for any questions or support. The NBSAP Forum is a global partnership to support the development and implementation of effective national biodiversity strategies and action plans. It is hosted by the Secretariat of Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Development Programme, and the United Nations Environment Programme. Don't forget to follow the Sustainable Production and Consumption NBSAP theme. Hope you all enjoyed this session. Have a nice day and night. We look forward to your active participation in this course. And I look forward to meeting you virtually next week on Wednesday webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.